Okay, Matt, what I want you to do first is bring us up to date on you. This is all about you. When you left
Okay.
after eighth grade, pick that up.
I stayed for ninth grade, actually.
Did you stay
And I did. And then I went to Suncoast
right?
and did the math, science, and engineering program and the international baccalaureate program there. And then I went to Harvard for undergraduate. I was there for 4 years. I graduated in 2000 and moved to New York City, trying to figure out what I wanted to do next. I thought I might want to go back to graduate school, but I thought I wanted to do something other than school for a couple of years before I did that. So I worked for a software company for a little while and taught some Kaplan and odds and ends to meet my expenses. And then I ended up back at NYU for graduate school. So I got a PhD in philosophy there. And then right out of NYU, I finished in 2008 and got a job as an assistant professor at UNC, moved down to Chapel Hill, and then got tenure in 2013, and I've been here since.
That's it. You're tenured.
I am.
Tenured. So I've been doing television, I watch some games or that, some nature shows. I've been doing a lot of reading, and what I've gotten into, when I was in school, all through high school, before that, college, I was never one much for science or math. I did okay, and it never interested me that much. So I'll be darned, though, when I went to start teaching, I needed to get a course in psychology at the University of Pittsburgh. So I went to get, since I wasn't in education, I had no education courses, all English and that. So I needed a course in psych for my certificate. So I went to sign up, and they said, all educational psych courses are closed. I said, I need a psych course to get my job. They said, there's only one. I said, I'll take it, whatever it is. Skinnerian psychology, the most fascinating course I ever took.
Is that right?
Matt, I'm still confused today. Maybe you're going to help me. I remember reading some philosopher said, begin in certainty and end in doubt. Begin in doubt and end in certainty. I'm in both. I'm you know what I mean? And I still haven't determined whether I believe in determinism or free will or not. I haven't determined that. And then getting into the reading I've been doing when I got into memetics, as far as whether or not consciousness, I don't know about this consciousness. And I've been working with the selfish gene. Have you ever gotten?
Dawkins, yeah.
Yeah, and there are certain questions. I accept all the Darwinian. I accept all that. However, there are certain aspects of it that I can't get into, because even in the selfish gene, I notice he's saying the gene wants. And as soon as he says wants, that gives me the idea you're talking about autonomous man, something who wants.
I don't think it's often very convenient to speak in terms of, well, the car really wants to keep going forward, but you have to turn it if you want it to go this way. And we speak in these metaphors, but I don't think usually in the context of these types of things, we really mean that the car wants anything. We just mean that it has a tendency to act in a certain way, absent forces, and they're going to have to intervene if you want to change it in any way. And I think the selfish gene stuff is supposed to be the same sort of way. The gene doesn't really want anything, of course, but the gene is naturally inclined to try to replicate itself. Why? Well, because genes that replicate themselves better tend to be much better represented in successive populations than genes that don't. And so we pretend that there's this want or this desire to spread itself, to copy itself, but we usually don't really mean anything terribly weighty by it. I think that's mostly metaphor.
Okay, and that's number one. Second, when I took that course in psychology and Skinner, I really got sold on determinism, that I really got sold at no free will. I made a decision that no, there is no free will. So I was okay with it for long. And then a couple of years ago, was it? And by the way, I used some of Skinnerian things in school with you and other students. Intermittent reinforcement.
Yep.
Worked all the time. I don't praise you every time. Every 7 successive approximation, all those things okay. And then a couple years ago, I'm reading something and it says, big breakthrough. They have determined that determinism has been shot down because of subatomic physics.
Yep.
What? And my question, well, wait a minute. How do you extrapolate physics, subatomic physics, to free will? How do you do that and use that to puncture this thing? Okay, help me there.
I don't think they have much to do with each other, to be perfectly honest with you. So first of all, there's, as you may know, a pretty significant controversy inside of physics about just what indeterminism that's associated with quantum mechanics really comes to. There are some people, so-called collapse people who accept certain interpretations of quantum mechanics, who think that the world is irreducibly in an indeterministic place. There are other people who endorse what are sometimes called hidden variables theories, according to which really it's deterministic underneath it all, but there are reasons that the world conspires to make it seem as though it's fundamentally indeterministic. But I've never really thought that these issues having to do with free will and so on had very much to do with these controversies about whether the world is deterministic or indeterministic. And the reason is that it's never been obvious to me that indeterminism is any more hospitable to free will than determinism is. So, I mean, you can imagine presenting the threat to free will coming either from determinism or indeterminism. So from determinism, the thought is, look, it's determined what I'm going to do. And so I don't really have any free choice over what I'm going to end up doing. But it seems to me that indeterminism poses an identical threat to free will. I mean, if indeterminism is true, if there's really ultimately God plays dice with the universe, to use Einstein's phrase, well, then really nothing determines whether I decide to turn right or turn left, or to marry A or marry B. And I don't see how that's any more hospitable to my acting freely if it's really just a matter of chance whether I do one thing or another, rather than if it's a matter of causal determinism whether I do one thing or another. So it's never seemed to me that these debates about physics really have very much at all to do with eternal questions about free will and so on.
How do you your attitude towards memes?
Memes, like internet memes?
Yeah, memes, they're the genes and the memes. That's the memes are now our new thing. The cultural, what do you call them? Memes are units of cultural inheritance.
Right.
Whether you,
yeah, I mean, so I think there's useful analogy here. I think sometimes we can get misled if we take a metaphor too seriously, or if we take an analogy too seriously. There certainly is an analogy between genes replicating themselves and cultural memes replicating themselves. Genes that are very successful at creating lots of copies of themselves and making sure that they find expression in successive generations, well, there are going to be a lot of those over time, whereas the genes that are less successful at doing that are going to disappear. And the same thing is true of cultural items of various descriptions. The ones that are sticky, the ones that are viral, the ones that spread are the ones that we expect to see a lot more of in the future, and the ones that are not so interesting, not so intriguing, not so exciting to people are the ones that are not going to spread in the future. So I think that's a unavoidable truth, that things that do a good job of replicating themselves and sustaining themselves are going to be a lot more common in the future than things that don't do such a good job. But of course, the mechanisms through which genes do this are very, very different from the mechanisms through which cultural items like memes do this. And so I think it's useful to point to the analogy, but I think we can run into some trouble when we take that analogy too seriously, and when we start to think that there's anything like an evolutionary process that exists in the biological world that is similarly going to exist in the cultural sphere.
Okay, now Matt, fill me in on your branch. What are you majoring? What area of philosophy are you?
I'm really interested in belief and evidence. I'm really interested in what it takes to have a reasonable belief and what it takes to have an unreasonable belief, and what kinds of ways of responding to evidence are good and responsible and truth conducive, and the sorts of things that we ought to be encouraging in ourselves and others, and which kinds of methods of belief formation are fallacious or confused or in some other way not the sort of belief forming mechanisms that we want to try to instill in others and follow in our own lives. So that's the broad category. The fancy name is epistemology in the philosophical world. Questions about the status of knowledge, status of justified belief. But I'm really interested in more particular questions about whether certain types of inferences are good ones, especially in the context of scientific inference, and also in the context of legal inference, the kinds of inferences that we tend to think are good in the legal context and ones that we don't think are good. I think the kinds of issues that come up there are very different from the kinds of issues that come up, for example, in science. And so why we might think that some mechanism of forming a belief is really good when we're doing science, but not so good when we're in the courtroom. That's a really interesting question to me that surely implicates all kinds of questions about values. What are the values that are at stake in the courtroom? And what are the values that are at stake in science? And of course, some of those values are going to overlap to some degree, but they're also going to diverge in important ways. And so I'm really interested in questions about how the values that are operative in a particular sphere of experience have these dramatic impacts on what we ought to say about how we respond to evidence, how we form beliefs, how we change our beliefs in response to arguments and new evidence, how we change our belief in response to disagreement by smart peers that we find out are think about things differently than we do. So that's the kind of broad category of what I think about.
Now, I'm sure that you'll come across this idea that in taking it back to genes and memes, beliefs, they're so, for just in the area of religion, there are certain ideas in religion that have been placed so strongly. So I mean that that no matter how much evidence you give, look at some religious fanatics, no matter how much evidence you give, you're never going to convince them that the earth.
Well, it's not just religious beliefs. It's we see the same thing, I think, a lot in our politics, especially with regard to conspiracy theories. Somebody thinks that, whatever it is, the media is conspiring to force everyone towards this political candidate or away from that political view or whatever it is. And of course, you point out there's no evidence for that. And they'll say, well, that's just because they've covered it all up. And, the core belief is just that the media is lying to you and there's no amount of evidence that can persuade you otherwise. And it almost takes on the tone of religious fervor in many cases, right? It's
Sure. And in many cases, as I'm fearful of in the next month or so, can do as much damage as religion has done as far as violence.
Right. And I think that one philosophical approach to this, an approach often goes by the name Bayesianism, which has gained an influence in recent years. It certainly plays a big role in statistics and engineering and the sciences and so on, sort of warns against some of these dangers. And one way of interpreting Bayesianism is as a kind of warning against ever being too certain of anything, because the thought is that once you become certain of something, then you'll always remain certain of that thing, regardless of what evidence comes across your path that might suggest something different. And so the warning is, except in very unusual cases, you might be very confident in something, you might be 0.999% sure of it, but be really careful with anything that you ever assign a confidence of 1 or on the other side 0 to, because the thought is that once something's at a 1 or a 0, it's locked there forever and you lose the ability to ever respond to evidence, to ever hear somebody who disagrees with you. And there's a sort of warning there that I think plays an important role in our scientific lives. Don't ever get too committed to anything, because if you're 100% committed to anything, then it makes you ignore really important developments and ignore really important evidence. And I think that advice is really valuable also in the context of politics and frankly in the context of our personal lives. If you believe that someone can do no wrong and you're unwilling to ever revisit that, then you can get yourself into some serious danger.
I don't know if you remember when you first came in 6th grade, all my 6th graders, and in 8th again, I would repeat it. I'd tell them, what we're trying to do here is make critical thinkers.
Yep.
They'll say, well, what is a critical thinker? I said, you're going to need 4 things. Number 1, you have to be a good reader. If you can't read well, you're not going to be a critical thinker because you can't read enough good information.
Yep.
Number 2, you're going to have to be a clear writer. I'm not saying great, good, a clear writer, using the language, following most of the rules, etc. I said, and those are the 2 things that we're most concerned with in school of teaching you. Now, the third thing to be a critical thinker, you're going to have to be fair and objective. That's going to be a little more difficult because most of that you're going to bring to school with you already from being home in your family with your peers. And the fourth thing you're going to need, you're going to have some moral courage, because as some of you have already found out, you're going to be disagreeing with your peers, with your government sometimes, with your school, with your church, your synagogue, with your parents. That can be very, very difficult.
It's an incremental process. It's not something that happens one day. It's something that happens over the course of decades. And, I think lower school teachers play a role in that. They take a role in advancing students just a little bit further down the path. And then the middle school and high school teachers hopefully push a little bit further, and the college teachers a little bit further, and grad school or people who you interact with at work or in life. So it's not something that anyone can gain credit for. It's something that happens over a course of decades. I think part of it too, with regard to politics, is there's this sense, at least in our country, that there are two sides to any issue. And you're either on one side or you're on the other side. And, I think for almost any issue that has any interest in complexity, there are lots and lots of different sides. I mean, to think that on a topic like abortion or capital punishment or criminal justice reform or tort reform, or who's going to be a good leader for our country, or how to structure our Congress, or how to structure our judicial system, to think that there are just two sides to that, and that people should line up on the left side or people should line up on the right side and sort of fight, is really to do a tremendous disservice to the complicated discussion that should be happening around all these things, where there are far, far more than two sides.
Is getting back to memes, those memes that have been planted as far as the religious, et cetera, et cetera. I know the meme that was planted in me up until I hit college was that you have a free will. Our whole Western thought has been based on that, right? You have a free will. And then I'm reading Skinner and says, no, that's an illusion. You have chocolate ice cream and vanilla, and don't tell me there's chocolate and vanilla. I have a choice there. And even though I love chocolate, I may pick the vanilla. And the professor told me, he said, yeah, because you wanted to be arbitrarily, that was part of your, and given the right circumstances, that's how you were going to behave. And the reason that they gave in there at the time they were teaching, and the reason it's bad to talk about determinism was the next step beyond it was control. Control. If you were able to show that by altering the environment, the thing, then the next step is control. And that's where they said Western man rebelled against that, of course. So I don't know.
Well, these are, of course, deep and hard questions. I have to believe that there's room for free will somewhere in this picture. Exactly how to formulate that and how to correspond it with the undeniable fact that we're susceptible to a wide range of influences. Of course, the Skinnerian influences. The advertising industry wouldn't exist unless we were susceptible to a certain amount of control and influence at a, let's call it, sub-rational level. But I have to believe that there's some room for free will somewhere in there. I just, I think to believe otherwise is sort of inconsistent with the project of being a human being and the project of pursuing our own ends, pursuing what we take to be valuable in the world.
There's something so strong there that says there has to be some free will somewhere. Maybe it's not operating all the time.
That's what I believe too.
Just in, but that thing is so strong. That thing is so strong that what I'd be interested in seeing among scientists, psychologists, psychiatrists, what percentage believes in free will And what percentage believes in determinism? I'd be curious about. Do you know of any surveys done like that?
I haven't done, I mean, of course, there's a complexity here, which is not everyone thinks that free will and determinism are incompatible with each other. I think there are a lot of scientists who would say, look, I believe in both free will and I also believe in determinism. And there have been quite detailed philosophical positions that have been articulated according to which determinism is no threat to free will. Determinism might well be true, and yet for all of that, we have free will. Now, exactly how that picture goes is, of course, complicated, and not everyone's persuaded by that. But I think there's actually quite a lot to be said for the position that determinism is true, and yet for all of that, I have free will. It depends exactly on what you mean by free will, and there are a couple of similar but subtly different things that we might mean by free will. Some people by free will just mean if I had chosen to do something different, I would have been successful in doing that other thing. And of course, determinism is perfectly compatible with that. The world may have been such to have determined me to eat chocolate ice cream, but if the world had been different, such that I had been determined to want vanilla ice cream, I would have been successful at eating vanilla ice cream. For some people, that's enough. For some people, that sort of situation is perfectly compatible with both determinism and free will. So, and of course, other people, they go by the name incompatibilists. They think free will and determinism are not compatible with each other. And so insofar as determinism is true, free will has to suffer.
Matt, it's been great. I wish
Wonderful to see you.
Thanks again.
Absolutely. Wonderful to see you.
And you remember, if you're in town, give me a call.
Absolutely.
We'll have lunch. Okay. Thank you.
Very good.